ACM Game Studio's first workshop, Intro to Unity. So first thing I'm going to cover is just what is Unity. So you guys are all probably here because you're interested in video games or making 3D art, something along those lines. And there's a lot of ways that you could go about doing that on a computer. If you really wanted to, you could go ahead and write out hundreds of lines of C++ and make your computer display some static or moving images, but that's not really efficient for doing anything. So we use something called a game engine, which is what Unity is. Unity is sort of a combination between an IDE or a development environment where you can program, as well as a physics engine, rendering engine, and a bunch of other stuff. That's all super important and makes it really easy and streamlined to make games, especially for people who don't have as much experience programming, and just for anyone who wants to expedite the process of game making. There's a couple other game engines that exist. The other primary one that you might have heard of is Unreal. We use Unity here. It's a little bit more beginner friendly, but both of those exist, and there's some other things you could use to program, but we will be teaching Unity. Okay, so this is what we're going to be making by the end of the tutorial today. It's just a pretty basic game where you can move around a character. Yeah, it's going to be kind of laggy on that screen. And go around a little arena and pick up some squares. It'll get a lot more interesting next week, but this is going to teach you guys the basic fundamentals of moving around in the Unity game engine, as well as some of the basics of creating a player and pickups, all that sort of fun stuff. All right. So first thing you want to do is go ahead and open up Unity. And then up in the top corner, it might ask you to sign in or something. If you do, you probably created an account when you downloaded Unity, so just sign in with that account. Did you have a question in the front? Okay. And so then once you get to this display where it's probably just going to be a blank screen, you can go ahead and click New in the top corner, and it'll give you some options for creating a new project. I'm just going to go ahead and call this Rollaball. You can call it whatever you want. For your save location, I just have a folder where I store all of my Unity projects. It doesn't really matter where you put it. And then for the template, make sure it's set to 3D. And then you're going to click Create Project. If you have a couple other options, like something might say about like Unity Analytics, you don't need that. That can just be turned off. And then Unity is going to go through its thing and set up your project for you. Does anybody have any questions, any issues getting to this point? Feel free to raise your hand and we can help you out. Okay. Is everyone to this screen? Is anyone not on this screen yet? Okay, so I'll take a few minutes more.
So we'll mostly be doing like 3D stuff?
So this one's just going to be 3D. Most of our tutorials are going to be in 3D. We'll probably have one in 2D. But yeah, Unity's primarily 3D, but you can do 2D as well. 2D is a lot easier, for sure. A lot of them have it open. Oh. Yeah, it takes a lot longer. Like the first time you open it up, it should be a little bit faster once you use it a little bit more. Yeah.
Will there be any like PowerPoints or anything from each of these presentations posted, or do you just have to be here today?
Well, right now I'm recording my screen, so everything you're hearing now and seeing will be posted online on our Facebook or on. We'll post it somewhere. And then we also have a text-based tutorial that should follow roughly along what we're doing today. And so if you at any point want to review that, you can feel free. It's going to be online. It'd be probably helpful to go back through it if you don't feel like you have the strongest grasp on what's going on. So yeah, they'll be available.
Okay, thank you.
How did you get it? So like the scene is on top and then the game is on bottom.
Okay.
I just have two separate tabs.
Awesome lead in. So this here is the editor. So you see I've got a couple windows here. Your guys' scene might look a little bit different just because I've moved things around. This is kind of how my workflow goes. But there should be a few tabs that are basically the same. So if you see in the top left corner, it's the scene view. Right now you don't see anything in there. You can just see like a little logo for where the camera is and a light. But we haven't put anything in the scene. It's basically just an empty space. Directly below that, on my screen, you have the game view. That is what the main camera is looking at currently. So if I was running the game right now, that's what my player would be seeing. Once again, there's nothing in the scene, so you don't see anything. Over to the right of the game view, you can see the file system. So that just shows sort of the organization of if you had like character models or scripts or anything in the project. Those would all be over there, and that's how you can find stuff that's saved in the project, but not necessarily in the game. Below it is the console. That's for like debugging information, and you don't have to worry about that too much right now. Directly above it is the scene hierarchy. That's where you can see a list. It's right here of all of the objects in the scene. And so when you click on an object, then on the box over to the right, that's the inspector. And so there's some information about the object in the scene. So here we can see the light that we have in the scene and the camera, and then that's all we've got currently. So you can also drag around the different objects or the different little windows and like resize them, and you can like move stuff around if you want. This is the way that I've got it set up. It's probably easy if you guys have it set up similarly, just because then it'll be maybe a little easier to follow along. But it really doesn't matter how it's laid out. Any questions? And then also at the top, you can see a little play button, pause button, and step forward. What these will do, this will run the game, and then while the game's running, you can pause it, and then you can step forward frame by frame. So for example, if I hit the play button right now, the scene starts running, and nothing really happens. The game is running at this moment, but there's nothing in the scene to do anything, so you just see the blank world. And then you just press the play button again to exit play mode. Okay, and so at this point, if you're still if you still haven't opened Unity yet, or you haven't been able to get that open, and you need help with anything, please raise your hand, because I'm just going to go ahead and move on into starting creating some of the basic stuff in the scene. Okay, cool. So now we're going to go ahead and create our first object in the scene. So if you look right up here in the top of the scene hierarchy, there's a little button that says Create. Click that, and it'll bring up a drop-down menu. We're going to then go to 3D Object and Plane. And so, as you can see, that creates a little plane in our scene. You can also, I think, drag and drop stuff from here if you just like select it and drag it. But, okay. Has everyone been able to get the plane into the scene? Alright, so now that we have an object in the scene, I'm going to show you how to move around the scene view. So in the scene, this is where we can sort of select on objects, like here's the plane, or click on the camera. And we can also move around. It's sort of just like a 3D moving camera. And so if you left click, it brings up this little eye icon, and you can look around. And then while left clicking, you can use WASD to move forward, backward, left, right, and then Q and E will move you up and down. And then you can also scroll to zoom in and out. And if you want to pan, this little button in the top corner that looks like a hand right next to the drop-down menu for Unity will let you move around the scene. Yeah, so you can click right click, or the center wheel, I believe, will both let you move around. Yeah, I'm just on a trackpad, so yeah. The controls are much nicer if you have a real mouse. Yeah. So the hand is just right up here in the top corner, and if you click that, that'll let you move around. You can switch between all of these tools in the top by pressing, no, that's not what you press. By pressing Q, W, E, R, T, Y, just like across the top of your keyboard, and it'll just switch between the tools. So Q would be the little hand to pan around, and then W would be to move the objects around. And then another important aspect, if you move away from your object, like maybe I fly over here and then I lose track of where my object is, I can click on the object in the hierarchy right here, and then move my mouse into the scene view and press F, and it will focus on the object that you selected. So does anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah. So does the plane show up in the hierarchy over here at all?
Well, it does, but when I try to focus on it, it doesn't.
Okay, so what you need to do, you need to click on the plane in here, so it's highlighted, and then you move the mouse into the hierarchy, or into the scene view, sorry. So over here, and then press F.
Yeah,
It doesn't show up? Can you help her out? Yeah.
Change the view like by rotating. How do you do that?
So you can do it by left clicking, or sorry, right clicking, and then it'll bring up like this little eye, and you can move around that way.
Wait, is that like two taps or like?
I'm not sure how you've got it set up. It's either control click, or you can do 2 fingers down on the mouse. Yeah, you have to hold it down, sorry.
Wait, then how do you like? What if I want to?
So if you hold down control and then press down the mouse pad, you can look up and down, left, right. Yeah. So you can zoom in by, if you have a mouse, you can use the scrolling bar, or you can scroll on your trackpad. Okay, so now, unless anybody has any questions or any issues still, I'm going to go ahead and start adding a couple more objects into the scene. So we've got our plane here, but we want to have some walls so that our player can't just roll off into nowhere. So we're going to go back up to the little create tag in the hierarchy, 3D object, and we're going to create, this time, a cube. And so now you'll see a cube's created somewhere in your scene. It's not necessarily at the origin, so I'm going to focus on it. And here you can see mine showed up under the plane. It kind of depends on where your mouse was when you created it. But if you want to reset the cube to the origin, we can just go right over here in the top corner under the inspector view. And it's kind of hard to see on this screen. It's just like right up here. I wish I had a pointer. And there's like a little gear tool. So if you click on that tool and then click reset, it'll move your object back to the center of the scene, to 0, 0, 0, and reset its size and everything back to how it was when you created it. Alright, and so now we don't want this necessarily to just be like a cube in the middle of the scene. We want to have it move over to the side and maybe stretch out a little bit to make it more like a wall. So there's a couple of tools that you could use to do that. So up in the top corner here, we have a move tool, we have a rotate tool, and we have a scale tool. Those are all right up next to where the hand is to pan through the scene. So right now I'm selected on the move tool, and you can see there's 3 arrows created up here. So there's one that's up, one that's in the Z direction, and one that's in the X direction. And so if you select one of the arrows, you can move this here just in the X direction, or I could move it up and down. And if you look closely in the center, there's a couple planes. So it's like a little, I guess, 3 little planes next to each other. If you select one of those, for example, right here, this blue one, I can then move in the YZ plane, so I can move it up as well as over to the side. In addition to just moving where the cube is, you can also change its rotation. So if you click right next to the move tool or hit E, it'll switch to the rotate tool. And here you can see a couple different axes, so I can rotate, for example, in the X-axis, or in the Y-axis, or a combination of them, and make sort of a weird offset thing. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Is anybody having trouble seeing this? Okay. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit clearer. So I didn't do anything in the scene. I just made it so that the screen's a little bit larger, so hopefully you guys can see a bit better. Okay, and so then in addition to the rotate tool, you also have a scale tool. That's just one over from that. And here you've got, similar to the move tool, you've got arrows pointing in the 3 different directions. So you can scale in a certain direction. So for example here, I can scale this long ways, or I can scale it down this direction. And so you can use this to manipulate the object as well. And if you click on the little box in the center, you can scale it in all directions. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the positioning on this. Have you guys all been able to try out the move tools and the rotate tool and the scale tool? Yes, so it's the fourth option over. It's if you press R on your keyboard, it'll jump to that, or you can just click up in the corner right next to the rotate tool. What? You want to turn the light off? I don't. Can you guys see the screen okay? Would it be better if the lights are off? Or is it fine now? Okay, cool. Alright, so now I'm just going to go ahead and use some of these move and transform tools to push my cube over to one edge. And I'm going to stretch it out a little bit. Just so it forms a little wall. Make it a little bit narrower. And you can move around. It's not really, doesn't have to be super exact, especially with this tool to move it around. So I've got it positioned here. It's just sort of acting as a wall over in the back corner. I'm actually going to go ahead and just have specific transforms to, or a specific position to put it in so it fits correctly. So in addition to moving any objects in the scene view with the tools here, you can also go directly over to the inspector, which is on this side, and you'll see there's a value called position with an X, Y, Z. There's a value called rotation and a value called scale. And so you can just go directly and type in numerical values in there, and it can help you get a little bit more precise if you're looking to build something that's right next to itself, or right next to another object. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this to negative 5.25 for the x direction. I'm going to set it to 0.5 for the z or for the y direction, and I'll keep it at 0 for the z direction. And then I'm going to set the scale to 0.5 for x, 1 for y, and 11 for z. Okay. So now I've got a wall that's sort of sticking out the edge over here, and it's one side of the cube, and now we need to go ahead and add some other sides in. So does anybody have any questions up until this point? Yeah.
Like when you change the scale, do you have to do it like by pulling those arrows? Do you have to do it like symmetrically? Can you like just change it?
So the scaling value is always going to be a symmetrical value, just because there isn't, I mean, in 3 dimensions, it's not really a concept of like, am I moving it to the right and left? So if you want to just move it to scale it to the left, what you would do, you would scale it and then shift it to the left afterwards. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, raise your hand if you don't have the plane and the first wall set up yet. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and create a couple more. So rather than going up to the create tool and doing the 3D object, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this wall. So you can just click on the object named cube in the object hierarchy and just press Command or Control, depending on if you're on Mac or Windows, D. And it should create another one called cube parentheses 1. And so then for that one, since we're already set up to the length and the size on, I guess this is the north wall or something, we can just drag it straight over to the other side. And now we've got 2 walls set up. And then we can do the same thing again. Just duplicate this. And you can either change the direction by rotating it 90 degrees, or I'm just going to change the scaling. So I'll just change this to 0, and then 5.25, and then change for the position, and then change the scale to 10 for x and 0.5 for z. And then I'll do the same thing with the other wall that I duplicated here. Yeah. The scaling? Okay. So do you want to see like the... Oh, okay, yep. So it's negative, or 0, 0.5 and negative 5.25 for positioning, and then 10, 1, 0.5 for scaling. All right, does anybody need more time to finish setting up the walls? Okay. All right, so now that we've created a couple objects in the scene, maybe we want to know what exactly we've been setting up here. So we're just kind of dragging and dropping stuff in, and it's a little important to know how Unity treats this stuff. So every single object in the scene, so our plane, the cubes we've created, the light, the camera, all of those things are known as game objects. And a game object just refers to something in your scene. And it could be a camera, it could be a light, it could be a character, it could be any number of things. And so all of these game objects are built up of a series of components. So when I click on, for example, this cube right here, over in the right, we have our inspector, and this is where we can see all of the components that are attached to our game object. And so we can see the cube has a transform, which is just a position plus a rotation plus a scale. It also has a couple other things here, a mesh filter and a mesh renderer. Those just tell Unity what shape it's supposed to display there. And then we have a box collider, which just tells Unity to treat this as a object that things can run into. So in addition to creating game objects with just components attached to them, you can create a hierarchy of game objects. So you can have a parent game object, and it's got children underneath it. And so we're going to go ahead and create an empty game object because we want to organize our scene a little bit. It's getting sort of cluttered with these 4 cubes and the plane. So we're going to create an empty object, and we're going to use that to group all of the walls and the floor together. So go back up to the hierarchy tool, or the hierarchy window, click Create, and click Create Empty. And so this should just create an empty object called Game Object. All it has is a transform, like a position on it, and we're just going to rename that Arena. So are there any questions about game objects or components? Okay, and so then once you create the empty game object, we're also going to make sure we reset its position. This is pretty important with when you're making things apparent of another object, because Unity does some weird stuff behind the scenes if you don't have your parent objects scaled to 0, 0, 0 when you put the children underneath them. So just make sure you reset it. And you'll see that it says 0, 0, 0 for all the values and 1 for the scale. And then to make the 4 cubes and the floor into the children of the arena, we're just going to select them all, either by using, you can just click on one of them and then do Shift to select all of these. And you'll see that they're all highlighted in the scene hierarchy and in the scene view. And then we just drag them onto the arena object. And so it should create something like this, where you see the arena, and it's got a little drop down, and then inside you see the plane, cube, and all the other objects as part of the arena. And so this is nice because we can then close that drop down, and it cleans up our scene hierarchy view, and we just have the one object. Plus, it also allows us to move the objects as one. If, say, we wanted to move the arena over to the left, we can click on the arena, bring up the little moving tool, and just move all of the walls and the floor together as one. And we could still go in, I'm going to reset that. We could still go into the arena and say we wanted to move the floor. We can move that individually if you select on the plane object inside the arena. Does anybody have any questions about that? Anyone need help? All right, so now that we've got a fairly basic scene here, it's looking a little boring, so we don't necessarily just want white walls and a white floor and no contrast. So we're going to go ahead and create a material in order to change up the color of the scene. So down in the file system, right here, go ahead and right click, go to create, and folder. And we're just going to name this folder materials. This is just organizational. You'll find, especially as you start working on group projects in the winter and spring quarter, it's really, really important to keep your projects organized, because otherwise you end up with something where no one really knows what's going on. So then double click on the materials folder to enter into it, and it should just say this folder is empty. And then we're going to go ahead and left click there, go to create, and go to material. It's about right there on the list. And so it should create this thing called new material, and I'm just going to name this floor. Any questions? Yeah.
Is the materials thing a new folder, or is it supposed to be?
So the way that I've got this laid out right now, you can see there's assets, and your assets folder is basically where everything associated with the project goes. Unity already creates the scenes folder for you, unless you're running an older version, in which case it might just have like sample scene or something, not be in a folder. And so then I've got assets, and then right inside assets is materials, and then inside materials I've created the floor. It's not super important that it's organized. Everything will still work otherwise, but it's a good practice to start early on because it makes it a lot easier later. All right. So once you've created the material, if you look over in the inspector, you'll see a whole bunch of boxes and sliders and stuff you can deal with. Materials are the way that you make anything in the world a different color or a different texture or a different, like make it glow. There's all sorts of stuff you can do with it. It basically is the appearance of any object. For us, all we're going to do is change the color for this. In later tutorials, we'll show you how to put on like a grass texture or something to make the world seem a little more realistic. But all we're going to do we're just going to go right here underneath where it says main maps, and you'll see a little white box. Click that. It'll bring up a color picker, and just pick any color you want for the floor. So I'm going to set mine to nice blue, and then you just hit X in the corner. And so now you should see in the bottom where it previews the material, it should be a different color. Has everyone been able to create a material and change the color? Does anybody need more time to catch up on this or anything that we've done so far? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, cool. All right, so now that you've created the material and changed its color, we're going to apply that to the floor. So all you need to do is you can select the material like this, so it's highlighted in the file system, and then you can drag it directly into the scene. And you'll see it gives you a little preview, and then just let go, and it applies the material to the floor. So now if you go back to the hierarchy and click on the plane, and you look down at the bottom, you'll see it shows a little thing with floor, and that's your material that you just created attached to the object. All right. So now that we've got our scene looking a little bit nicer, it looks good from the scene view, but if you look down in the game view, it still kind of looks just like a edge of a white box. It's not most impressive. So at this point, we need to go ahead and move the camera. So in order to do this, you can either select the camera in the scene view, or you can select it in the scene hierarchy over here, and then we can just rotate it or move it. So move it up a little bit maybe, and then we can rotate it downward. That's sideways, downward, no. So something like that. I'm just going to go ahead and set mine directly to a position of 0, 6, and -6. And then a rotation of 50, 0, and 0. So now we've got our camera looking down on the scene. Not too much to see there, but we're in a good position to start adding new stuff into the scene. Has everyone got their camera set up in the position that they want it to be? All right. So this is the part where we're going to go ahead and begin to create the player. So this tutorial is absolutely no coding experience required, and there's a lot to do with game development that doesn't involve programming, especially with 3D artwork, design, level design, music. It's really a huge field, and coding is just one portion of it. But I would like to get just a show of hands. Who here's programmed before in the past? Okay. And how many people are interested in the more non-programming aspects? Okay. So if you're not super interested in programming, that's fine. The player character that I'm going to be creating up here, that we're going to be working on, it comes as part of a standard asset pack as well. So you don't really need to write any code for it if you just copy the thing from Unity. we're still going to create the code in order to just get some experience with that. But if you don't want to do it, if you are not interested in programming, feel free to just sort of tune me out for the next 25 minutes or so. I have put the game scripts, the finished scripts online. So if you just go to tinyurl.com/game-scripts, they're all up there. And so when we get to that part, you can just copy and paste them. For everyone else, if you're interested in programming, you can just follow along. I'm going to assume sort of like a base level of knowledge of the programming, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask what any terms mean, what anything is. We want to make this open to everyone of all levels. All right, so now we're going to start creating the player. So we'll just go to the Create tab up here. Yes, so I should clarify. Unity, all of the scripting is done in C#. If you haven't worked with that, that's fine. It's very, very similar to Java. It's actually Microsoft's clone of Java. And it's similar to a lot of C++, other languages that you'll be using in classes if you're taking the CS30 series. Yeah, it's pretty easy to pick up, but once again, don't worry if you don't have any experience with it. It's not required at all for game making. So we're going to go to 3D Object, and we're going to create a sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call it Player. And I'm just going to reset its position and just put it 0.5 off the ground. So it's just sitting right there on the plane. All right. And then another thing I'm going to do with this is change the tag. So in Unity, all objects can have a tag value. That just lets you, when you're scripting, find objects more quickly and like compare to check, like, okay, if the thing that ran into me or the thing that just shot me is the player, maybe I give them points or something like that. So we're just going to go here underneath the name where it says tag, and currently it says untagged, and we're just going to call that player. You can also add your own tags, but Unity provides a couple default ones. All right. And then one more thing we need to do, we need to add a component to this. So we're going to go down to the bottom of the inspector where it says add component. Click that, and we're going to type in rigid body. And make sure you do rigid body, not rigid body 2D. Just click enter, and it'll attach this component. So what a rigid body does, it allows any object to interact with Unity's physics system. So essentially it tells Unity to treat this like a regular object. So if it's a ball and was on a hill, roll down the hill, or it'll fall, or it'll bounce off a wall. It just tells Unity to interact with it within the physical world, as opposed to right now our walls and floor don't have that, so they won't just fall into space if we start the scene. It's rigid body. All right, is everyone up to this point? Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Sorry. So the rigid body is basically, it tells Unity to treat this object like a physics object. So it tells Unity to have gravity act on it and have like other forces act on it. And so it lets us go into the scripts and do something like add a push to it in order to move it around. And it allows you to interact with other objects in the world, so you can run into stuff. It's a lot of Unity code hidden underneath the hood, but that's basically what it lets you do. Anything else? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so that's a good question. So the rigid body is for the physics system, and so that's like gravity and forces, things like that. So that allows us to push it around and move it. The plane, if you click on it and you look at its components, you'll see it has something called a mesh collider. So it has a collider that'll stop objects from just falling through it, but since it doesn't have a rigid body, it won't do things like fall out of the scene, or if even if something falls into it really quickly, it won't push it out of the way. So it basically is more like a static object. All right. So has everyone got their player with the rigid body attached? Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and add a script onto the player. So down at the bottom, we're going to click Add Component, and we're just going to type. It should appear for almost anything you search. Just New Script down at the bottom. You can type in New Script if you want. And we're going to name this Player Controller. And so the style in C# is just to have, I think that's Pascal case or camel case, where you have the first letter of each word capitalized, including the first word. And so then just click Create an Add down at the bottom, and you'll see there's a little script down attached here. And Unity might do some spinning beach ball of death or other delay because it tries to run through some compiling. Okay? And so once you've got the script created and added, you'll see where it's got sort of a grayed out name down here. If you double click on that, Unity will open up MonoDevelop or Visual Studio or whatever you have as your selected editor, and let us do some programming. Yeah, so Unity will normally prompt you to install MonoDevelop. Personally, I like Visual Studio a bit better. Doesn't really matter what your IDE or your development environment looks like. It's really up to you. They did? Okay, well that's good. Yeah, so then Visual Studio, I guess, is the default, which is nice. Okay, so has everyone, yeah. Okay, so if you go down into the component view, all the way at the bottom where it says Player Controller Script, and just double click on like the grayed out thing that says Player Controller, that should prompt Unity to open up your IDE. And then if you want to change what editor Unity opens scripts in, you can just go up here to Unity at the top, go to Preferences, and then in External Tools, you can do the External Script Editor, and you can choose whatever you want. There's probably like just one option there. Yeah. Okay, so you go to Unity, Preferences, and then External Tools. And then it's just right at the top, External Script Editor. All right. So you go to Unity. If you have Windows, that's a good question. So I am not sure where it is. It's like under Preferences or
What's
something.
the next drop down?
So it's Preferences. Preferences. It might be under File Preferences or something like that. Okay, so for Windows, you click Edit and then Preferences, and then it brings up this little window, and you click External Tools, and then you can switch your editor. All right, so has everyone got this? Yeah.
How do you get the player controller?
Right down here?
Yeah.
So what we did, we went down to Add Component and went to New Script. You can either type in New Script or it's kind of the default whenever you run out of options. And then just named it Player Controller, and it should automatically attach it. Yeah.
So I think there are preferences and external tools. Which one was the actual option that you changed?
So it should be. So it's External Script Editor, and there's going to be an option depending on how your editor is installed in your computer. You might need to browse and go to like the exe if Unity doesn't recognize it by default.
It says internal by default. Visual Studio.
Oh, then that's fine. Yeah, so I guess internal will just bring you up to whatever you've set as your system's preferred editor, which could be like Vim or something like that. So be careful. One has a Mac charger because I did not realize how quickly it was going to turn my battery down. Okay. All right. So has everyone got MonoDevelop or Visual Studio or whatever your editor you're going to be using open, and the script that says playercontroller.cs at the top? All right. So let me just quickly explain what the script is, what Unity's default sort of script is created for us. So we can see here we have using system.collections, using collections generic, and using Unity game engine. Those are similar to Java if you have like an import statement and it lets you bring in different libraries. And so what this does, it connects us into the Unity game engine. That's the most important one. And then here we have public class player controller mono behavior. And so that just tells Unity that, or it tells Unity that the name of the class is player controller. That's the name that we entered in. It's important that you don't change this, or if you do change it, you also rename the file, because if these are mismatched, then you'll have problems, and it's kind of annoying to figure out because they don't give you good explanations as to why things aren't working. And then the mono behavior, this just means that player controller inherits from mono behavior. Every game object in Unity is inherited from mono behavior. And then within, we see there's two methods that Unity's created for us. So we have a start and an update method, and they put in a nice little descriptor. The start method is automatically run at the beginning of every single scene, or at the beginning of when the scene loads. And then the update method, is run every frame. So these are just the two default methods. Unity's got some other ones that you can put in that'll get sort of automatically called, but you don't ever have to worry about calling start or update, and you really shouldn't ever call start or update by yourself. Unity handles all of that stuff. Okay. So now that we've got this set up, we need to declare a couple of variables at the top. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to create a public variable. If you're not familiar, public just means that it can be accessed from, or pardon me, we're going to create a private variable first called private variable of type rigid body, and we're just going to call it RB. And so rigid body is capitalized. You might have like a nice code complete thing like this. And then I'm just going to call it RB. Any short name is fine that's somewhat descriptive. And so what this is going to do, this is going to give us access to the rigid body that we attach to the player and let us manipulate it through the script. So private just means that nobody outside of this class can manipulate the variable at all. It's all within the class, and nobody else is going to be able to see it. So we've declared the name of this, private rigid body RB, but if I were to run the script right now, RB is just nothing because I didn't set it equal to anything. So we now need to interact with the editor in order to find the rigid body. And so in the start, on the very first frame, we want to find our rigid body. And so we're just going to do game object with a lowercase g dot get component. That one's camel case. And then these little angle brackets, and then rigid body. if I can spell. Oh, yeah. Is that better? Okay. And then 2 parentheses and semicolon. Everything in C#, similar to Java and C++, all lines have to end in semicolon. So what this is going to do on the very first frame, we're going to take game object. The lowercase game object right here refers to the player that this is attached to. And we're going to get component. So we're going to find the rigid body. And we're going to, at the beginning, say RB equals that value. Yeah.
So if we open up a similar script for, say, wall, would game object refer to the wall?
Yes. So yeah, the game object refers to whatever object the script that you're currently editing is attached to.
Okay.
So you could also say this.gameObject.getComponent, but it's a little superfluous in this instance.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so has everyone got that set up? Does anyone not have that set up? Raise your hand. Okay. So now that we've got the rigid body, we need to do something with it every frame if the player's pressing like the arrow keys, for example. So Unity's got something called the input system, and what that lets you do, it lets you get input from across different platforms. Because Unity's a cross-platform game engine, so like I'm making this on a Mac here, but I could make it run on a Windows computer or on Xbox or Nintendo Switch or iOS or Android. Since you can deploy it to anything, if I say, okay, if the W key is pressed, move forward, it's not exactly the best practice to do that because, for example, if I'm using a controller, there is no W key. It's a different method of going forward. So what we use Unity's input system. So we're going to first create a float. And for anyone who doesn't know, a float is just a floating point value. It's similar to a double, and it just means it's like a decimal point. And so we're just going to call this x. I'm going to say float x equals input with a capital I dot get axis, and in double quotes, x-axis is horizontal. And it's got to be spelled like that, otherwise it will not be happy, with a capital H as well. And so what this is going to do, every single frame, we're going to assign the value of x, and we're just going to say, okay, so x is whatever Unity tells us the horizontal axis is going to be giving us. So if we're on a controller, for example, this could be a value of like 0.25 if you have the controller stick slightly to the left, or if you're on a computer and you have like the A key pressed down, it'll give you like a value of -1. So it'll just give you this ranged value just to tell us what the player is currently doing, what input they're giving us. Any question about that? Yeah.
How does it know that, say you're using a keyboard, how does it know that it's horizontal? Because what if you set your keyboard to be W goes up? Yeah,
so Unity takes care of a lot of that input mapping under the scene because, I mean, the raw stuff they're getting, especially from controllers, is really kind of messy. So they handle all of that. I think Unity provides a input system where you can go in and change and say like, okay, I want W to actually mean backwards or something like that. You can remap keys for specific types. That's a little bit more advanced, but for now it's basically, it gives us a nice input for 2-axis movement. All right, and so then once we've done that, we're going to create another variable. We're going to call this float z equals input dot get axis, and this time vertical. And so the reason I'm calling this z is because the coordinate system that Unity uses is a little different than the one that you've used probably in math. It's a left-handed coordinate system. I know my right from my left. Left-handed coordinate system. So like, if you picture it on the board, we've got like normally this would be your XY axis. So here's X, here's Y. That's an X, Y. And what Unity does, they add the Z direction, sort of like this, off into space, which is different from math, where you'll have X, Y into space, and then Z is straight up. It's kind of a weird quirk, but you just have to deal with it. And so now we've got our two variables created, float x and float z. And so now what we need to do, we need to add force to the rigid body to tell it to get pushed in a certain direction. So what we're going to say RB, which is our rigid body that's attached to the player, dot add force. And then what this takes in, it takes in a vector3 argument. So who is not familiar with what a vector is? Don't worry about it, it's fine. So I'll just give a real quick explanation. Your math classes will do a way better job than me. You can just sort of think of a vector as like a point in space with three values. So in this case, it's x, y, z. So it's either a 2D or 3D line segment, but also point. So it has a direction. So for example, if I have the vector 1, 1, 1, it points, on this example, it's going to point 1 unit in the x direction, 1 unit in the y direction, and 1 unit in the z direction. It's going to be like this point right here. I'm sorry that you're all the way in the back. You feel like you can't really see. And so you think about it as both like a set of numbers, so 1, 1, 1, but you can also think about it as like a line directly to that point. And vectors are super useful. You'll find them a lot in Unity, and you'll get a lot more comfortable with them just working with them. But here's just a representation of it on this image over here, where you've got like the x component and the y component. This one's just a two-dimensional vector. And then you have the a, which you can think of both as a point at x comma y and as a line going from 0, 0 to x comma y. And so we use vectors in Unity for a lot of stuff, especially forces as well as positioning. And the Unity vector3 type is pretty integral. And then vectors, you can also do stuff like add them. So just like the way that you would add a vector. So let's say I had the vector 0, 1, 2, and the vector 3, negative 1, 1, I don't know. And we add them together. You just sort of add across. So here's like our x, y, z. So you just take 0 plus 3, and that equals 3. And then you take 1 plus negative 1, 0, and then 2 plus 1 is 3. And so this is your resulting value. This is a really bad dry erase marker. Okay, cool. Any questions about vectors? All right. So rigid body.add force takes a vector in because we need to specify a direction that we're going to add the force. And so to create a vector, we just say new and then vector3 because we're in 3 dimensions. And then you need a double parentheses there. Okay. And then it takes in 3 values. So in this case, we're going to put in x, comma 0 because we don't want to move in the y direction. We don't want our ball bouncing at all. And then z. And then semicolon. Oh, yeah, I need a comma there. Cool, thank you. And then go ahead and hit Command or Control S and save the script. Has everyone got that all set up? Does anybody need more time?
So, once I installed the Visual Studio on Mac,
Mm-hmm.
and the game object and vector3 are not yet not defined at all.
So it's possible that if you didn't install the Unity like debugging, or I guess what do you call it, like the Unity, yeah, I don't know. There's like packages that you can install with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or whatever you're using that'll teach it like, okay, this is what a Unity engine is, and these are some of the things that I can use. If you don't have that, you might see like red squiggly lines underneath, and it'll give you warnings and complaints. But as long as you have it saved in the correct spot and everything else is good, you can ignore those. It's best to get the support for Unity programming because it'll help you with a lot of things like auto code completion. But so what? It depends on what platform or what IDE you're using. So for Visual Studio Community, when you download it, there's like an option to install like Unity debugging and Unity like code snippets. If you're using Visual Studio Code, then there's like packages that you can install. Just like search Unity, and they'll give you like stuff like that. Mono Develop should come with it natively, and then I'm not sure what other editors people are using.
If we already had like Visual Studio installed before for like a C++ or like CS1,
Yeah.
how do we add the Unity like to it?
I'm not sure where that would be. It might be under like preferences, maybe something like that. Maybe IntelliSense. No. I've got a thing down here that says tools for Unity. My guess is that that'd be something like you could potentially rerun the installer for it, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Yeah.
Sorry, just to respond, I'm pretty sure it's an extension
For Visual Studio Community or for VS Code?
for Visual Studio Community.
Okay.
Because there's an extension submenu.
Got it. Where is that? Tools.
Like Visual Studio Community.
Extensions. Okay. Oh, game development. Yep. Visual Studio Tools. Okay. So it looks like you can install it from there. You could also look it up. I'm sure a Google search of Visual Studio Community Unity support will give you good results. I'm sure Microsoft's official website has some good information. All right. So now that you got this file created, go ahead and save it. And we're going to, that's not what I want. We're going to switch back over to the Unity editor. And at this point, make sure that you save your scene. So just Command or Control S, and just there's like a little star up here next to sample scene that should go away just to make sure that you saved it. If you're using an older version of Unity, it might ask you where you want to save the scene. And you can just save it anywhere within the assets folder. And it's important to make sure you save your scene, especially before you try to run the game, because when you run the game, that's when things could have a bug and crash and then lose all of the work you spent hours on. Yeah, that's fun. So once you've saved it, go ahead and hit the little play button up there. And you should see that if you press like the W or one of the WASD keys or the arrow keys, you should see that you can move your player very, very slowly around the scene. But we probably want our player to move a little bit faster because it's kind of boring to just be moving through molasses. So we have that vector 3, the force that's pushing on the player. We need to multiply that by some value to make it a bit stronger. So go back over to Visual Studio, back in the update method, and you see where we're going to add this in the add force. But we don't want to just say times 100 or something, because then anytime we want to change it, we have to go back into the script and change it, and it's not convenient for updating during editing in the Unity editor. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a public variable. So right above where you have private rigid body RB, create public float, and you can call it something descriptive like speed. And so Unity deals with public variables in a pretty cool way. They'll let you change them within the editor. So we're just going to go down here, and we're going to take this new vector 3, multiply that by speed. Make sure it's after the parentheses, after the z parentheses, and then you do times speed. Yeah.
Where should I put the extension package?
I'm not sure how the whole installing of the extension works. Jarrett, do you think you could help him out in a second?
It won't compile unless you have it.
It won't compile unless you have it.
Yeah.
It
At least it
should. What's not compiling? In the editor or in Unity?
It can't find rigid body in Unity.
Where are you trying to compile this? Like pressing play on Unity. Can I see?
Okay.
Should I give it a I just added it?
So yeah, go back to your. Where's your player control? Where it
Should be under assets.
under assets. It shouldn't be an issue to compile it.
I think I might have found out how to install something. Go to tools.
Under Visual Studio.
Yeah, in the Visual Studio.
Tools.
And then the first drop down, what is it again?
Visual Micro.
Oh,
I'm a little bit different.
Are you on Vision? Are you on Mac? Or, mine closed because I had to install it. So
So if you weren't able to run the scene, can you raise your hand and we'll, okay, cool. So we'll get some people around to make sure that you guys have got that set up. Yeah, there's can be issues with that. If you have the, what do you call it, like the Unity IntelliSense or whatever, like the package installed, you can sort of preview by pressing this little run up in the corner. And it should like compile it so you can see if there's any issues there. And you'll see something like build successful if it worked. And otherwise there might be like an error message printed out in the console. All right, so if you're still having trouble, can you raise your hand and we'll try to get around to you? Yeah. Okay. Do you have like a specific issue? Okay, so if you hit the play, is there like a message printed out at the bottom? Did you create the? Can I see your? Sorry, can I see your code? I think that you probably didn't assign something at some point, and that's what it's giving you.
Yeah, it's great. I'm gonna have to figure out how to do all this. That'll be easier. I don't have Arduino.
Oh yeah, so you're just like RV equals.
Because Arduino has a whole lot.
And then also, if you guys are having some issue with like the script where it's giving a compiling error, where it says something in the script, you can also go and compare it with the script that I have posted just to see if you have any discrepancies there where you didn't assign something or some typo. That's on tinyurl.com/game-scripts. Once again. Does anybody else have problems? Yeah.
You already know what's happening. Visual Studio. You just I don't think you can.
Yeah.
I've normally had Yeah, that's why I Surprise.
Yeah, it has to. Yeah, it has to.
You can't summarize it or not.
That's true. That's true.
So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, very, very fun. Well,
I haven't had too much time to play
we
those.
got it's exactly something. Yeah, exactly.
So, are you part? Do you go to Bruce?
I wasn't able to make any of the meetings so far, but I am.
Finally got to go.
Yeah, every Friday.
Yeah. Or they have one on Thursday.
Oh, yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
So I finished on one because I've never
Sorry.
So
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. If you are still having issues, we can still get around to you, but we're running a little short on time, so I want to keep going so we've got a playable game by the end of this. All right, so we finished off right here where we have rb.addForce, new vector 3 times speed. So we created the public float speed, and I'm also going to say public float speed equals 100. And that's just going to give it a default value, so it doesn't just default at 0 because, I don't know, 100 is probably a goodish speed. And if it was 0, then it might not move when we try to run the game, and it can be frustrating to find where that issue is. And so then there's one more thing that we need to multiply this by, and that's a value called time.delta time. So what that means, since update runs every single frame, if you're running on a PC that's running at 60 frames per second, this will run 60 times every single second, and so it'll add a force 60 times every second. However, if you're running on like a console, maybe you're only running at 30 frames per second, and so in that case, the ball would be moving half as fast. And you want the games to be compatible across all platforms, across all frame rates, across everything. That's the goal with this. And so what time.delta time does, that just gives you the value between the most recent frame and the current frame. So it'll be like some decimal value, probably like 60 or 1 divided by 60 or something like that. But what it does, it scales the force that you're applying by the frame. So if I'm running at 60 frames per second, each frame I'm going to be applying half as much force as someone who's running at 30 frames per second. So in the end, it works out so they run at the same speed. All right, any questions about how time.delta time works? Okay. So then once you've got that and saved it, we're going to switch back over to Unity. And if we click on our player and scroll down, we see the little script value that's created. And Unity might give you the little spinning wheel because it's recompiling. If we click on the script, we'll see now there's a little value down at the bottom called speed, and it should be filled in just with 100. And so you can go ahead and set that to any value you want. Setting it too high is not going to be great because you'll move too quickly and like phase through walls because Unity doesn't do calculations fast enough. But 100 or 200 is a good speed. And so then once you've got that, go ahead and save the scene again and enter play mode. And this time you should see you're moving around a fair bit faster. I'm keeping mine at 100. 200 is probably a reasonable speed. All right. Is everyone to that point, or does anybody need help? Please raise your hand. We got people to assist. All right. So now that we've got our player moving around and that moves around the scene, we probably want our camera to follow the player since we don't want the player to be able to fly out of view at some point if we were in a larger arena or something. So we need to move the camera. Unfortunately, because it's a ball and it's spinning, it's not as easy as just taking the camera and making it a child where it would move with the player because it'll roll around and it's a huge mess. So we need to create another script in order to move the camera. And then just a reminder for people who are not doing the coding, they're still available online. So if you want to just copy and paste those, that's cool too. So we're just going to click on the main camera. We're going to go down here to add component. We're going to add a new script. And I'm going to call this camera controller. And then click create and add. And so then once it adds that, I'm going to go ahead and double click it, and it should open it right up in Visual Studio or whatever you're using. And so here we're going to have to do a little bit of vector math. So don't worry about it too much. It's pretty simple addition. And if you want to conceptualize it more or have more questions, you can feel free to ask afterwards.
After,
Yeah.
are you the location of extension package?
I'm not sure about the whole thing of installing the extension for Visual Studio. I can try to help afterwards, but I'm not probably the best person to ask about that. I'd follow Microsoft's instructions. Okay, so within the camera, we need to first add a reference to our player's position because we need to know where the player is in order to follow it. So we're going to create a public variable, call this public transform with a capital T, and we'll just call this player. So a transform, we've been dealing with them a little bit in the inspector. It's just that value that stores a position, a rotation, and a scale. And so you can access it in the script as well. And so in the start method, we need to calculate an offset for our camera because the camera right now is positioned a little bit away from the player, and we want to keep that same distance between the player and the camera. And so we're going to create a private variable up here underneath our public transform. We're going to call that a private vector3 offset. And that's going to be private because only the camera needs to know about where the offset is in order to move. And so in the start method, we're just going to say offset equals what? No, it's not a new vector. Calm down. So offset equals this dot transform dot position. And so remember, this just refers to the camera, to the object of the camera. Dot transform, and the transform is the position, rotation, and the scale of the camera. And then dot position is the camera's position. And then we're going to subtract off player dot position. Yeah.
Why wouldn't you use game object instead of this?
So you could use game object. That wouldn't be a huge issue. But a transform is slightly smaller in memory. Like there's some optimizations there. And then also, since we don't need anything else associated with the player, it's more helpful to just have the position of it.
Okay.
Plus, this way, on this line, we don't have to say player.transform.position. It allows us to just sort of like shorten that a bit.
Okay.
Generally, if you don't need to use like the full game object, it can be a little bit more efficient to just have a part of it.
Gotcha.
Yep. Any other questions about this? All right. And so then on the update, all we need to do is change our position. So we're going to say, again, this.transform.position equals, so we're setting our position now. It's going to equal the player.position, because this is going to change every frame if the player is moving, plus the offset. And so that means every frame we're going to be tracking the player's position and plus the amount off that we are, and we're going to be updating the camera. So the camera should sort of track the player, but a little bit above and looking down at.
Oh, how can I exit the
So has everyone got that set?
how can I exit the camera controller?
So what we're going to do now is we're going to switch back over to Unity, and if you click on the camera, it's going to take a second and do its compiling thing. Make sure you have the script saved as well. And now if we click on the camera, we see there's a little value down here called player with none in it. And so we need to set that to the player variable. And so we just click on the, don't click on the player, but drag the player from the scene hierarchy, drag it down to the bottom into that little square where it says none parentheses transform. And it should give you a little thing that says player parentheses transform. And so that's just tracking a reference to the player's position. Has everyone got that? Any questions? Yeah. Okay, so what you do, you just take the, it's kind of hard to see on the screen. You take the player and just drag this right down here into the component, and it'll automatically attach the player's transform to the camera. So now the camera has a reference to the player, and it can follow it every scene, or every frame. All right, and so once you got that, go ahead and save the scene, hit play, take a second, and now you should see that the camera follows the player around. Does anybody have any issues with that? Raise your hand and we can help. Yeah, did you have a question? Or just an issue?
Yes. So up to you. Froze. You should see the X-ray. Oh, but you still are hungry, that's like this.
Yeah.
We were standing outside of the hotel gateway to San Francisco. Why?
No, it shouldn't matter which frame rate.
So yeah. So the public just sets a default value. You can change it in the editor. So it changes the first time you attach the object. So if I attach a new script to a new thing, it'll set it to 10,000. But if I've attached it and then I change it at any point, it'll change. It's a little.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's a little weird.
All right, so now that we've got our player moving around with the camera following it, there's nothing really for our player to do, so we should give them something to pick up and collect. So we're going to go ahead and create just a couple little cubes for our player to pick up. So we're just going to go to Create and 3D Object and Cube. And I'm just going to scale this down a little bit so it's a little bit smaller to 0.25, 0.25, and 0.25. I'm going to put its height off the ground at a half. And then I'm just going to rotate it like 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 30 degrees. It doesn't really matter. Rotate it however you want it to look pretty. That's kind of up to you. And then we are going to rename this to Pickup. All right. And then we also want our pickups to stand out to the player. So we're going to create a new material for it. So we're going to do the same thing we did to create the floor. Just click on the materials folder, right click, do create, and then material. And I'm just going to name this pickup. And I'm just going to change the color to nice yellow. And then if you remember when we created the floor, we dragged the material directly into the scene view over here. But that might be difficult because this is kind of a tiny object. It might be hard to reach it. So we can still drag it directly up into the hierarchy view onto the pickup. And it recolors it. Yeah. All right, so has everyone got that set up? Okay. So now I'm going to save the scene and enter play mode. And if you see, when I run my player into the pickup, it doesn't exactly behave how I want. So I bounce off it. We don't want that, because pickups should be just collected and then used by the player for something that we maybe develop next week. So in order to make the pickup not collide with the player, we have to change the type of collider that's on the pickup. So if you click on pickup again, and you look down at the second to last component down here, you'll see it has a box collider on it. And what we want to do, we want to switch that from a collider to a trigger collider. So there's a little box that says is trigger, and we just check that box. So what that's going to say is tell Unity not to interact with this as like a physical object that you can run into or bounce off of, but rather as an object that whenever you run into it, it sends a message to some script and like can call some functions. But it doesn't change our direction if we run into it. So now if you run the scene again, and you move over, you see that we pass right through it. All right, any questions about trigger colliders or different colliders or anything that I've covered? All right, sorry, I'm moving a little quickly because I want to make sure you guys can get out of here by the end, and I want to make sure you got this sort of finished game set up. So now that we've got our pickup, we want to do something when the player runs into it. So for now, we're just going to take it off the map. They've collected it. It should just go away. So on the pickup, we're going to go down to the bottom here and click Add Component. And we're going to do New Script. And I'm just going to call this Pickup Controller. So then once you've done that, we're going to open it up again and go into the editor here. And it's not being happy with me. It's okay. So we don't need any of these two functions that Unity's provided us. So you can just go ahead and delete the start and update functions. And we're just going to have one function in the pickup controller. And it's just going to be one of Unity's default functions. So you can just type private void on trigger enter, I believe. I don't have my code completion, so let me check this out.
Yeah, it'll be you can
Okay, yep, on trigger enter, and then in parentheses to the variable it's passed the function, it's collider other. And then you need to do the curly braces for the method call. And so what this is going to do, this method is going to be called every single time that a trigger collider is entered that's attached to this object. And so whenever the player runs into it, this method is going to be called and all the code inside is going to be executed. So the first thing we want to do, we want to check something about the collider other. Collider other refers to the player. So we're going to say if, just have a if statement here, other dot game object or dot compare tag, and then we're gonna say player, because if you remember at the beginning we tagged our player as player. If that happens, then we're gonna do something, and all we're gonna do is destroy this dot game object. All right, and so this is important that you tagged the player as player, because otherwise running into it is not going to do anything, because we're never going to execute this if statement. And you want to have the condition here checking if it's called player, because otherwise, for example, if you put two cubes close enough to each other, they'll enter each other's collider and they'll destroy each other. And you don't want that to happen. All right, and so then once you've done that, go ahead and save. And go back to Unity and enter play mode. And then you should see, if you move toward the object and run into it, it should disappear off the screen. So if you want to, yeah, raise your hand if you have a question. Does anybody have any broad questions? Yeah. So sorry for all of the underlined stuff. For some reason, Visual Studio, while I was over here, decided to just not be happy with anything I'm doing. But this is all correct. So you just need to have the function private void on trigger enter. I need to make sure that all the capitalization, everything's spelled correctly, because this is a Unity specific function. And then it's just the if the other dot compare tag, and that's just gonna, it's basically like a string comparison, but they give you a somewhat neater, somewhat neater syntax for it. Unity gives you. So if it's equal to player, then you say destroy this.gameObject. And it's important that you say this.gameObject instead of just this, because if you just say this, all it's going to do is it's going to destroy the script. And so you're just going to have the pickup with no script attached to it, and everything else is still going to be there. Whereas if you say gameObject, it removes everything attached to it from the scene. Does anybody want clarification on what this is? Okay, I'm going to clarify anyway. So this basically refers to the object we're attached to at this point. So you can think of it as saying destroy the pickup that I'm attached to when I'm saying this.gameObject. You could just say destroy gameObject, I think, and that would work, but sometimes it's nice to say this.
although the pickup object was held, but once the ball reached the pickup object, the pickup object does not disappear though.
The pickup object didn't disappear? Okay. Did you make sure you tagged the player as player? Yeah, so just click on your player, and then the drop-down tag, the drop-down for, like right underneath the name, and make sure it's set to player.
Wait, I'm not sure. Tag what?
So if you look, I'll go back to the screen. If you're over here on the player, in the top corner up here where we have the name player, there's this little value underneath that says tag, and you just want to make sure that's set to player, because that's what you're checking for. So if it's untagged, you're never going to remove the object from the scene.
Yeah.
All right, does anybody else still need help? Okay, so we're basically there, but we probably want to have more than just one pickup in the scene. So what we could do, we could just duplicate this a lot of times, but that's kind of sloppy. And what if we want to do something where maybe the game later on spawns new pickups in the scene? So we need to create something called a prefab. So we'll go back down here to the file system. We'll right-click, do create folder, and we're just going to create a new folder called prefabs. And then enter into the folder. And then all we have to do to turn this object into a prefab is you select the pickup. So you select the object that you want to prefab from the hierarchy, and you just drag it straight down into the folder. So just drag it in, and Unity will automatically create a prefab. And so now if you see we've got this little pickup object in the file system, that means it's saved as a object within your file system, and if you wanted to in a script, you could create new ones. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. And if you look in the hierarchy, you'll see that the pickup has now turned blue, like the text on it, which indicates that it's a prefab. And so we can go ahead and just delete this from the scene. And it's still saved down here. And so now, if we want, we can just create a bunch of these. So you can just drag it straight into the scene and drop, and you can do that multiple times. Just dragging from down in the prefabs folder the prefab called pickup, and just dragging it straight into the scene, and you can sort of sprinkle your scene with a couple of these little cube things. And then once you've done that, we probably want to organize them like we did with the floor and the walls. So we're going to click the little create drop down again, create empty. I'm just going to rename this pickups. Make sure you reset the value, that's really important, to 0, 0, 0. And then I'm going to select all of the pickups and just put them underneath that object. And so now it's cleaned up a little bit. All right, any questions up until this point? Yeah, so right here. So in my case, I didn't reset the position. It shouldn't matter too much if a prefab has a position because that's generally going to be ignored. It's probably better style to like set this all to 0 values just so that it's a little bit cleaner, but then keep the scale and rotation the same because the position is going to be determined by where you drag it into the scene. All right, and then you can just save the scene and hit run. And it should work where you can just go down, collide with the pickups, and as you run into them, they get removed from the scene. And then that's it. So congratulations, you just made your first game in Unity. Good job, yeah. So yeah, this was a kind of basic game, but it definitely got over the sort of like the basics of how to use this, and you could really extend this quite far. So next week we're going to be continuing off of this same tutorial. So if you weren't able to get your scene to like a spot that you think you would want to build off of next week, we'll be posting a link to online where you can just download the project, like the finished project, and we'll be able to build off of that next week. And then I also invite you to sort of extend and do something else if you want with the scene. You could do something like make the player jump if you wanted, or maybe make the pickups move. So we're also going to have a bit of a competition this quarter in order to inspire you guys to keep working outside of the tutorial series. So throughout the whole quarter, we want you to build off of the tutorials that you do and just create your own sort of mini games and just explore and get used to using Unity. And we will have prizes at the end of the quarter for the 3 top games that we think that are the best games that have been developed based on the tutorial series. So we welcome you to keep building these, and the prizes are going to be like fairly nice Amazon or Steam gift cards. So that's definitely something to work for. I don't think we have a breakdown of what the first, second, third are going to be, but I think first place is going to be like maybe $40 or something. So that's cool. You could get a cool game. And then if you guys have any more questions, feel free to stay here. I think the officers are going to stick around for a little bit. So if you have any questions about that, we still have Diddy Reese cookies. So on the way out, you can grab those. And thank you guys so much for coming to the Unity tutorial. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you so much.